We really thought it was timely and important that we take a little bit of a closer look at Indiana. From afar, it may have looked like Indiana was sort of spontaneously combusting, but there actually was a lot of great work that had been happening for more than a year. And so we thought we'd start a little bit with what Freedom Indiana is, how it was created. And Tyler, can you kick us off with that?
Of course. So one of my roles is that I'm the senior advisor to American Unity Fund, which was a group that was founded several years ago by some of the most major conservative philanthropists in the country, people like Paul Singer and Dan Loeb, Seth Klarman, and others, whose mission was to promote LGBT freedom and inclusion within the conservative movement. One of the first states that we prioritized for our work ended up being Indiana, and the reason why is that in 2012, the Republican-dominated legislature there had done the first step in passing a constitutional amendment that would have banned the freedom to marry in that state in their constitution. It was already banned by statute. That wasn't enough. They wanted to take it to the ballot and go through the constitutional amendment process. Our saving grace was that they had to do this twice. It had to go through the legislature twice. It had gone through the first time with nearly 75% of the support of the legislature, including about a fourth of the Democrats in the Indiana legislature. And so in that moment, I think that the national LGBT community rallied around this opportunity to say we weren't going to let it go through. We were going to make this concerted effort to derail the constitutional amendment. And to do that was going to take unprecedented cooperation with Republicans and with the business community in Indiana. So Freedom Indiana was born as this campaign that said that we are going to take all of the energy and the enthusiasm of the LGBT community, but we're going to find a way to bring that to the table with businesses. And so for the first time in the movement's history, we launched a campaign that from day one had the ACLU, Lambda Legal, HRC, Gill Action, American Unity Fund, all there, so you had all of the LGBT groups, along with the in-state group, Indiana Equality Action, as well as Eli Lilly and Cummins, two Fortune 500 corporations, both two of the largest employers in the state of Indiana, who joined that as co-equal partners. And in that moment, that was unprecedented. And not only that, but they would go on to provide over $650,000 in financial support to that campaign.
And what we did was we unleashed a campaign unlike any campaign Indiana has ever seen. We had about 60 field staff. Some, their sole responsibility was to call into targeted districts, and other people actually lived in the district of the representative that they were targeting. So they would do things like go to their favorite coffee shop and talk to their barista, and maybe their barista would be engaging and talking about this awful bill. Or my favorite story is that a woman, she had her favorite hairdresser in rural southern Indiana. The hairdresser is a big deal there. And she went in, and all of the hairdressers there were wearing Freedom Indiana buttons. And she's in there, I mean, you're kind of held captive there for about an hour and a half. She has a major dye job, so she was there for a bit. And they just used that whole time to engage her. And she ended up actually coming over to our side. So we were able to kind of go on all cylinders because of this.
Give us a little bit more nuance on Freedom Indiana. So how was it structured? How did it work?
Yeah, the campaign was governed by, we create these things, it's called a memorandum of understanding. And so all of the partners actually agree at the outset about how we're going to conduct this campaign together. And again, that's what was part of what was so remarkable about bringing the business community inside the campaign. They weren't just doing this as, we weren't just calling them up and saying, hey, can you do this? They were part of the board. They were part of the governance of this campaign that would go on to be successful in winning a third of the Indiana House Republicans and every single Indiana House Democrat. And so that was a huge flip from just 1 year earlier, whenever this had sailed through, we were actually able to knock down this constitutional amendment. And I don't think that we would have been able to do that unless the LGBT community had seen this opportunity to work exclusively, day by day, with the business community at the same table.
So 2014, big success, stop this from going forward. Take us forward. So how did then Freedom Indiana pivot into 2015 and fighting a RFRA?
So in a year and a half, we were able to defeat this constitutional ban, get the freedom to marry, and then we're hit with RFRA here and during this last legislative session. And so we already had the grassroots, because I told you we had those 60 staffers around the state. So we were really quickly able to, once we saw that this was going to be a big deal, we were under the understanding that there was a social truce in our legislature. The governor before Mike Pence had done that, and it was successful. Obviously, that wasn't the case. So once we knew that that was not going to happen, we were able to activate that grassroots network and activate our national partners as well as our corporate partners once again.
Right, and the far right had come back hard. I mean, what ended up happening is, in some ways, we were the victims of our own success in Indiana by defeating that constitutional amendment, which the far right groups, and they are numerous in the state of Indiana. There's actually 3 different statewide anti-gay organizations. And they were burned, and they were looking, I think, for retribution. And with everything that's happening on religious exemptions in the country, they just got swept up into that. And so Freedom Indiana, from the time that constitutional amendment had been defeated, the organization was still lobbying. It still had a very robust digital presence. And I think that's actually worth talking a little bit more about, is what Indiana was able to do in this campaign with digital is really a high watermark in the movement. And the organization that deserves, I think, the most credit for that is Freedom to Marry. Whenever they were involved in the defensive effort, that was huge. Freedom to Marry was a big partner in the original Freedom Indiana campaign. But what happened is, over time, their digital team, it's called the Digital Action Center, has become a resource not only for marriage campaigns, but now they've also been willing to help out with non-discrimination campaigns and religious exemption fights. And so I guess it was about the middle of last year, Bobby, that the Gill Foundation and American Unity Fund co-funded this project for Freedom to Marry, which has not only the best digital work in the movement. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. They have some of the best digital work happening in politics. I mean,
yes.
the awards that they win are unbelievable, whether it's Democrat or Republican or any other progressive issue. The digital team at Freedom to Marry has become a powerhouse, and one of the things that they were able to do was help turn on the volume whenever this religious exemption fight hit, maximum level in Indiana.
And because this was such a fast-moving situation, we didn't have time to go back into those districts. We didn't have the staff, we didn't have the time. So knowing that we had this, top-notch digital team on it, it made the difference. That was our grassroots.
It was, and the even better news is that digital work is going to continue, and many of those same people who have been part of the digital action team at Freedom to Marry are now working with Freedom for All Americans, which is the new national campaign to win non-discrimination in all 50 states. And so I think that those resources are so critical to our success.
Absolutely.
And it's part of our ability to fight back rapidly whenever these, whether it's an anti-trans bill or some other bizarre religious exemption bill comes out of nowhere. Digital is how we can respond the quickest.
And one more thing about the team. Sorry, I just love them, so it really is wonderful. I've been able to work with them for a year and a half, and have just, the thing that you get from this team is that they've covered the scope of all the LGBT issues. They know their stuff. And so even whenever it's questions that you probably shouldn't even be asking a digital team, like, do you think I should have a rally on this day? They have that kind of background knowledge, and they're able to kind of tell you what's happened in other states and what's been successful. So just an amazing resource, that's all.
So take us a legal disclaimer, first of all. Even in the midst of a legislative session, there are lots of opportunities to fund public education work. There are, I know at the Gill Foundation we have a very close relationship with our attorney who advises us constantly about the things we can and cannot fund. And so, this is a philanthropic conference. We're looking back and talking about a legislative session, but I think it's an important takeaway that there are very specific, impactful things that we can fund, C3, that actually can make a huge impact. And so, can you take us through a little bit how things unfolded? So you'd already laid the groundwork last year with all the great organizing. You come into this session. The RFRA comes out, guns a-blazing. Like, give us some behind the scenes of how things unfolded.
Well, it was very fast moving, like we said, and this was a time that we needed to kind of bring in more business partners. And that's where we were really able to work with some of our national partners to reach out to those. I know HRC was great with the tech community, as was Lambda. We were able to get AUF to come in and help with kind of lobbyist management. The ACLU was there really as my backbone for the day-to-day help and guidance along the way. That's kind of what we did.
Yeah, and I think if anything, we were still hoping that we could defeat the super RFRA outright. I mean, we were trying to find ways, especially once it passed the Senate and was in the House, we thought that there were still opportunities to derail it entirely. And I think that what we, again, underestimated was the conviction that these far-right groups had to have revenge. We really embarrassed them last year. We went into this conservative state and we won, and we flipped huge numbers of Republicans and the business community. And so in the middle of that tension, I think what everybody has to understand is that this was very top-down driven. Governor Pence knew exactly what it was that they were passing, and his team was adamantly pushing this and really punishing businesses who were standing in the way. And I think that that's just, on that subject, I think people do have to understand that our business allies who are supporting the LGBT community, they're not doing this without consequence. In Georgia, as a matter of fact, the jet fuel tax incentive program in the state of Georgia has been stripped, specifically as retribution to Delta for them being so out front on supporting LGBT freedom and opposing the RFRA. And even in spite of that, they've been a huge ally. But I think it's important for the LGBT community to understand that our business partners do face sometimes political retribution and real negative consequences whenever they stand up for us. And I think that that's why it's important that we now, in this kind of new era where the LGBT community and the business community are standing together, that we do have to remain really unified.
Right. And that the stripping of that tax credit was very widely publicized in Georgia. Yeah. So it was actually a disincentive potentially for other businesses who could anticipate perhaps similar consequences. So what did we actually win in Indiana? At the end of the day, a RFRA passed.
Yep.
We don't have non-discrimination protections. What did we win?
I think that what happened in the state with the public opinion matters a lot.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. We're turning the tides in Indiana. What we won is the stance of business to follow us next year in 2016. Communities that have never thought of things like HRO, or even communities that have never even thought of the word sexual orientation and gender identity. These things are at the forefront. These things are now at the table that were never going to be at the table in Indiana.
Yeah, and I think it's more about what did we extract from a loss. The RFRA passed, and they are passing. Last year, Mississippi passed a RFRA. Arkansas has passed, admittedly, they're passing RFRAs that aren't as awful as they could be, and we're beating them back. But I think that we have to be careful in how we describe this, that we are demonstrating incremental gains. And so I don't think that what happened in Indiana is a win. They passed a RFRA. What we were able to do, though, is we were able to embarrass them on the national stage and extract from Governor Pence, who is a right-wing anti-gay ideologue who said there was nothing wrong with the law. He had to sign a fix that admitted that there was a problem that protected housing, employment, and public accommodations from a RFRA defense, specifically for sexual orientation and gender identity. And not only is that hugely, a symbolic win, as Katie was mentioning, it also preserved the 12 different city and county ordinances across the state of Indiana where hundreds of thousands of Hoosiers do have LGBT protections, and now you can't use the RFRA, and by the way, this is what it's all about. The right-wingers want to use the RFRAs as a way to bring down our laws in courts. And now they can't do that with this RFRA in the state of Indiana. And so I think that has now set a new baseline for our movement, that whenever somebody else brings the next religious exemption or whatever it might look like, it's going to be compared to what the fix is in Indiana. And we're setting ourselves up for this argument that says that our civil rights protections aren't subject to religious-based discrimination. And I think that in that sense, that was the win, if you can call it that.
One of the challenges that if for anyone who heard the Movement Advancement Project's session this morning about the messaging we have now on RFRAs and non-discrimination protections, one of the real challenges we face nationally is proving the problem. Most Americans think that we are already protected. They're shocked to find out that we aren't. And moreover, they don't think that there is discrimination. So there's a big barrier in making the case for non-discrimination protections of getting past that. Tim Gill had a great quote. It's actually on the stands this week. There's a story in Bloomberg Business Week. And he said, in some sense, Governor Pence did us a favor because he helped elevate into the national dialogue this critical problem that we don't have non-discrimination protections. And now you see, 100 tech businesses self-organizing on their own, initiating a national effort to come out in support of proactively of non-discrimination for LGBT people everywhere, which is really phenomenal. Mm-hmm. So what's next in Indiana? How did this fight position you for what's coming next, and what is that?
Well, it's wonderful. Everybody is, we've got the spotlight still. Maybe not so much nationally anymore, but locally very much. And everybody wants to know, what's the next step? What can we do? So now we're having communities wanting to get human rights ordinances passed, and then the communities that already have them wanting to beef them up because some of them really don't have legal teeth. So now I'm working with lawyers from the HRC and from ACLU to draft model legislation, and I'm going into those communities and getting those passed with the end goal of getting full civil rights protections statewide.
Yeah, and the business community is going to be key for that as well. And I think that everybody should understand, the business community was caught by surprise as well. The Speaker of the Indiana House had made a promise to the CEOs of these same corporations that we've been talking about that they were going to have a social issue truce, and he broke that promise. So you can imagine how they're feeling about him right now. But aside from that, they forced the Indiana legislature to make a public promise that they will hear a statewide comprehensive non-discrimination bill. And that was huge, and that's, it's a public commitment that they are going to move this bill forward and it will be on the agenda. And for the business community, I think you should talk about the harm that happened to Indianapolis. I mean, this caused real economic damage, and so...
Catastrophic. Billions of dollars were lost. Ticket holders for, think of people that have season passes to NASCAR, to the Speedway. People were pulling out, which is shocking. I didn't know that NASCAR fans were that into equality, but they are, and it's wonderful. So people are pulling out. Our tourism industry is really hit. I was in meetings with the head of Visit Indy who said, at first I said this was a Katrina-like devastation, and now this is full-on Pompeii. And it's true, and it's going to have a long-lasting effect. And right now, we're really scrambling to bring people back to Indiana.
Yeah, the Indianapolis Bond Bank right now is actually having to go through a big process with S&P and Moody's, and they might be downgraded over this. I mean, this real economic consequences that was part of what was motivating the business community to find a solution. And I think this also goes back to, if the LGBT community had not had that earlier experience of working together with the businesses to defeat that constitutional amendment, I don't know how it would have played out here in this last fight. But I think what it shows is how important it is that the LGBT community engage the business community from the beginning of any single campaign that we run.
Let's pivot for a second for the impact from Indiana beyond, outside of Indiana, in other states like Georgia. Georgia, for example, where I know American Unity Fund was very heavily invested. Gill Foundation, a priority state, we were following very closely what was going on. Talk just for a minute, Tyler, about how that impact was felt elsewhere.
I mean, so Asa Hutchinson, the governor of Arkansas, called us during the middle of Indiana and during the middle of Mike Pence having to sign that fix, and was asking, what do I do to avoid that? And we gave him our best advice. And that was happening also with Governor Nathan Deal in Georgia. And part of the benefit of what American Unity Fund is able to do is that we're able to have those trusted conversations with Republican leaders and bring them along. Now, we all want them to move a lot quicker and a lot farther, but they're moving. And I think that what happened in Indiana, again, is that's now going to be the baseline. And that is going to be the measurement for every other governor, every other lawmaker who's looking at that experience and say they don't want to touch that. And apparently Arizona wasn't enough. We had been telling them all year, don't do that, don't do that. Governor Brewer had to veto it, and that's Governor Jan Brewer. I mean, if she even vetoed it, stay away.
Right.
And they still didn't quite believe us. I think now after Indiana, they might believe us.
Yeah, this year, everyone didn't want to be Arizona. Next year, no one wants to be Indiana.
Right.
We had, the governor of Michigan, the governor of North Carolina, Georgia, down to the wire, a RFRA that had passed the Senate. It was in a key committee about to get passed out, and it was killed in the very final hours. Kathy Woolard was, I think, probably sweating that about as much as anybody, and Jeff Graham. So they're coming back. ADF, I think the last number we saw was that there were 20, there was just a chart that showed them as a nearly $40 million organization. On their rate of growth, we're thinking they're probably a $50 million organization right about now. They're everywhere, from Pocatello, Idaho, to Atlanta. Everywhere we're fighting for non-discrimination, there's an ADF attorney there opposing us tooth and nail. What do we do to gear up for next year?
We were able again, American Unity Fund and Gill Action and Gill Foundation have been seeing this problem develop since Arizona, and seeing that, no longer the federal standard on the RFRA was no longer going to be where these things were at. They are far exceeding it in about 7 key areas, all of which undermine LGBT freedom. And by the way, these RFRAs, they undermine a lot of other freedoms, right? We're talking mostly about LGBT freedom here today, but these things are awful, and they have gone so far out of the bounds of what they were originally meant to do. I think that where we are winning right now is by making early investments in these states. We saw that Georgia was vulnerable, and so we staffed up. We invested. We have some of the top Republican lobbyists in that state working for AUF. I mean, these are the people who are, the campaign chairman in that state for the Republican governor and Republican presidential nominees. And so that's the level of commitment that it's going to take to derail this, is to get involved early and find really reputable, politically connected Republicans to help us carry this message behind closed doors. But I think that that's only a third of it. I think another third is engaging the LGBT community and energizing them and giving them the resources. And I think, again, Georgia is a model of that, of where organizations came together to make sure that Georgia Equality and the in-state LGBT groups had the resources they need to start to sound the alarm within the community. So that's the second third. And I think that the final third is the business community. And I think that people have to understand that business support is a bit of a double-edged sword. It's extremely powerful. It can have extreme influence on Republican lawmakers, but also at the end of the day, businesses will act in their own self-interest, and we can't begrudge them that. Delta did become a lot quieter after that jet fuel issue. I think that we have to work as much as we can to make sure that our business partners are protected, and that we have their backs as much as they have our backs. And I think that that's going to be one of the new challenges for the LGBT community, is how do we handle this great new ally in the movement, and at the same time understand that at some points their interests will be distinct and a little different from our own.
At the foundation, we talk a lot about creating the public imperative. From a C3 perspective, obviously, Tyler and American Unity Fund and others handle the lobbying piece. We can't fund that, but we can fund work around that to create what we call the public imperative, which is ensuring that the public is not only on our side, but it is really leaning into an issue so much that the pressure is felt by decision makers. You've heard from a number of folks who we've been funding. I think Faith in Public Life, the incredible work done in Georgia to engage Baptist leaders, folks who, Baptists dominate in Georgia. Having Baptist leaders standing up was critical. The incredible research from the Movement Advancement Project to help us understand very, very specifically how do we target even very specific audiences to make sure that we make the case against religious refusals and for non-discrimination. And then finally, we need to, the case has been made, the argument has been made that this can't just be about LGBT equality. Our opponents are so well funded, they're not giving up. It's a huge coalition of organizations supporting this. Homeschoolers are behind this because they want to be exempted from state education standards. The range of interest on the other side behind these things are really, really broad and powerful, and it's that same kind of effort that we're going to need to build. We're a little behind the 8 ball right now, but we're aggressively funding in some key things. We know that Georgia will be a hotbed again. Texas will continue to be one. It will come back in states like Arizona and North Carolina. So I think you've heard some great work this weekend that's being funded. We've made a lot of progress. We've got a lot of work left to do. But thanks to great folks in the States and our friends at AUF and other funding colleagues, we're really making a difference. And thank you both.
Thank you.